Shanti, I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you were on mute there because I couldn't hear anything and I was panicked for a minute.
Well, hello. It's Marvelous Monday. Welcome to Aquarius Rising Africa, everybody. And of course, I hope you've all had a fantastic weekend and did all the things that you shouldn't have done, because that's what weekends are about. Mine are anyway. And hello, Brice. How are you, honey bun?
Oh, I'm so excited. I'm so excited to talk about this, what we're going to talk about. This is definitely Murderous Monday because this family, man, they're quite
Ooh.
debaucherous and I love it.
So we're in for some juiciness, that's for sure. Looks like fun. And yeah, so nice to see you, Carol, Lisa D, always. Charmaine, you too. Nice to see all you guys in the chat. Yeah, usual suspects. Appreciate you all. So thanks for joining us, and everyone else as well. So yeah, we're talking about the House of Borgia.
I
Today.
love it. And we're going to be doing more because we're going to look at this family is so enmeshed, and that's a new psychological term for a toxic family. You can either be toxic where you're completely like don't know what each other is doing, or toxic to the point where you're enmeshed with each other. And I definitely think the Borgia family at this point was very, very enmeshed. And I cannot wait. You can't tell one story of one Borgia without talking about all of the Borgias because they all play into each other's lives. And I was telling Shanti off air, you guys, they say that the Pope that we have now is the current Pope is a descendant of this particular family. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't have any way to prove it, but I would not be surprised if that were the case at all.
It's seriously, I mean, let's think about that. How, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your idea of the possibility of that being true?
8 or 9. 8 or 9.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm like sitting on a 10.
Yeah. The only reason why I don't say 10 is because I have no one showed me the evidence or the family line, but I would say 8 or 9. That's probably. I mean, look at the Pope we have today. And do you want to show the painting? Not the real guy, because we're going to talk about the Showtime series as well, based on the Borgias, but the painting of the real Rodrigo Borgia. The side, it's the profile painting. He kind of looks like
this one here.
Yeah, like that's Rodrigo Borgia, like the real guy from 500 years ago. And even though it's been 500 years, and granted, like most of us probably don't look like our ancestors from 500 years ago because so many genes have been mixed in the mesh since then. But I can kind of see the Pope now, kind of, you know. And they do say that a lot of the Borgia's descendants today are living in South America, which is where, I mean, I'm not super up on the Pope's history, but isn't he from South America?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Which makes sense, which we're going to get to that because Rodrigo, there's a lot of things that Rodrigo, the thing about Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, is that he got famous, his family got famous for all their scandal. I mean, that's really why we're here, right? We want to talk about the inappropriate parties that were had at the Vatican. We want to talk about the scandal about maybe Rodrigo and his son Cesare having a incestuous relationship with Lucrezia, his daughter, and Cesare's sister. There's all these scandals. There's this, we're going to talk about them all individually. We're going to talk
about. When did they do that TV series?
Showtime? It was in the 2000s. So there was a Showtime series, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If your family has a series on Showtime or HBO, you come from a really messed up family. If HBO and Showtime has enough material to create a show, like you probably need some therapy. And so Showtime did it was 3 seasons. So there's another series, Borgia, Faith and Fear, that was done around the same time with another production company. But the Showtime, and I pull a lot of pictures from the Showtime because it's real, they have actors playing these roles. And Jeremy Irons plays Rodrigo Borgia in the Showtime series. Obviously, Jeremy Irons is a big actor in Hollywood, a big famous one. But the kids, and Jeremy Irons looks nothing like, in my opinion, the real The real Rodrigo Borgia, he's way better looking. But the kids, the people who were casted to play Cesare.
This guy looks quite chunky as well.
Yes, and now we can pull up Jeremy Irons as Rodrigo Borgia. Like, but the kids who play Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffrey in this series look identical. I mean, they did incredible casting with the kids, the Borgia kids. And like I said, you can't tell the story of Rodrigo Borgia without talking about his children. You can't tell the story of his children without talking about Rodrigo Borgia. This family is incredibly enmeshed with each other. Incredibly enmeshed with each other. Like this is like, I mean, this is like Maury. Do you guys have Maury? Like, who's the dad? Like, this is like crazy stuff that this family found themselves in. But when we talk more about the kids, I do want to look at the kids from like different perspectives too, because I do have a lot. I was saying to you offline, Shanti, when we get to Lucrezia Borgia, especially the daughter, I have a lot of empathy for her. Because this was 500 years ago, right? And she, you know, I've said it before and I've said it, I'll say it a million times. And I think we should make a t-shirt. Like, if I had to go back and live in history, even now, I'm so grateful. Like, I'm so grateful I'm a peasant now and not in the controllers of the world, like the shit that they do. Like, and back then I would so much have rather been a peasant than being born into this shit show and this dog eat dog world of the controllers. And I think when we get to the children, especially, a lot of the scandalous stuff that they are accused of doing, looking at it from all different perspectives, and we'll get into it more with the relationship between like the cardinals and their children and the Pope and their children versus what it would look like if these children had been born to a monarchy. Because again, just to kind of reiterate from last week, if you didn't catch our show last week, that might have shocked you that I said the cardinals and their children. Back in this time, just to review from last week, back in this time of history, with the cardinals and eventually the Pope, it was very common, if not expected, for the cardinals and the Pope to have children. That was expected for them to have children. All right. The only thing they couldn't do was get married. And the reason why they could not get married had nothing to do with modeling their life after Jesus's life. The reason why they could not get married and have legitimate children in a marriage was because those children would then be able to inherit the wealth and the power of the Vatican. Okay? So, why do I say it's advantageous for them to have children? As we learned last week, and we'll continue to talk about, there's no God in the Catholic Vatican. There never has been. This is a political scheme. And I know that's going to trigger people for me saying this, but literally, if you think God is in the Vatican, you know what? As Tamara would say, what Santa sled are you riding in, honey? This is a political entity. It is a monarchy, the papacy. But unlike the monarchies, it's not a bloodline.
Monetary system as well. It's a monetary system.
The monetary system, but
Big
unlike
bank.
unlike the kingdoms around Europe, the monarchies around the House of Valois, the people in England, the only difference is the papacy is not inherited through bloodline, right? It's so with that being said, there's way more crime. There's way more violence. There's way more bribery. There's way more betrayal. There are way more hits. Where do you think we talked about last week? I think that the Borgias were the inspiration for The Godfather. Like, it's not just the Borgias. It's the freaking Vatican as a whole. They're putting hits on each other. It is a dog-eat-dog fight for who becomes the Pope, because the Pope sits at the top of the pyramid. The Pope controls all of Europe, right? So this is a desperation for power. So when you are a cardinal, because your form of monarchy doesn't involve inheritance, having children as a cardinal means your children are then used as pawns to grant you more power. So if you are in line to potentially become the next pope, because these popes didn't live long back then, you could have like the French king come to you and say, I will back you. I will send money to back you as Pope if you can do X, Y, and Z for me. And also, I will give your son titles in France. So you scratch your back, so your kids are now pawns. And we're going to see this big time with Lucrezia Borgia, with the daughter of the Pope, because women are not autonomous beings on their own anyway. They're not really, they don't have their own autonomy. And so when we talk about Lucrezia next week, we're going to see this big time. So I want everybody to first like understand. No, Charmaine, they weren't nuns, kids. They were the mistresses. They had chief mistresses. So like Vonesa, who was Rodrigo's chief mistress, everybody knew who the mother of the baby mama was. They just couldn't marry them. So they were just normal people. It was very open that this woman was that guy's baby mama. He was her baby daddy, and they had all these children. Yeah, Joanne, she just watched it. I actually been rewatching it, and we're gonna talk. They did, a lot of times with these historical series, they do take some artistic license, and they might change some stuff historically. But from what I see with the Borgia series, they didn't change that much. And there's actually one scene with Lucrezia's first marriage that just broke my heart, knowing what happened to her, that we'll talk about next week, that they did a brilliant job showing, depicting that. But we got to talk about Rodrigo first. The main reason well, Carol, we'll talk about, so Rodrigo Borgia, before we get about the question about using the kids in rituals, I'm sure the kids were used in some rituals, but they weren't the ones that were being killed. Because these children of these cardinals and they were not, so let's back up a little bit, because
would they probably be considered hierarchy kids?
Yes. So I think that's where we're confused. These kids, so I think, Carol, this might be where you're confused. The kids of the cardinals and the popes were not a secret. They weren't hidden. They were treated like a princess and princesses, even though they were technically illegitimate. So they were hierarchy kids. If you were the daughter of the Pope, you could marry any king of England you wanted to, or king of Europe you wanted to, because you're the daughter of the Pope, and the Pope is the most powerful man in the world. If you have sons, your sons can then marry princesses of these huge monarchies. Even though your son is considered illegitimate, they are still valuable. They're not the bastards of I hate that word, but they're not of the peasantry. These kids is understood the only reason they're illegitimate is because their father is not allowed to get married to give them inheritance. So the children of the cardinals, not just the Borgias, Pope Innocent VIII, the one before Rodrigo, he had 8 illegitimate children that were running around with titles and marrying bacon families. Like, this is just common, normal society at this point. So I'm glad you asked that question, Carol, because I want to make that clear too. These kids were not hidden. They were not. And Joanne, you saw the series. You saw the way they depicted Lucrezia and Cesare and Juan. I mean, they ran around the Vatican like it was their own private playground. And it was. It was. They were taught, they were the creme de la creme of bloodline. So these kids were not hidden. They were not birthed in that hall and then used for a sacrifice. It's not, no. I mean, these kids were probably done and did stuff in rituals. They were gods to others. They were considered like demigods, right? Their dad's the freaking Pope or a cardinal. Cardinals are powerful too. So let's talk a little bit about how did the Borgias get into this place of power? So, we always have to figure out where they come from, because Rodrigo Borgia, actually, out of all the Borgias, in my opinion, he's the least interesting. Even though he's the puppet master of his children, he is the least interesting. He did some things historically that we got to talk about that kind of get swept under the rug, because the debauchery is way more interesting to talk about than some of the political stuff he did that kind of shapes there's some stuff that he did in his papacy that we are living results of some of the things, which we'll talk about, that people don't talk about that much, again, because, the big orgies at the Vatican are way more interesting and salacious to talk about than some of the policies that he passed that affect us today. So the House of Borgia, so Rodrigo Borgia is known as the Devil Pope. all the popes are devil popes. I mean, I've got a list of devils who openly sold their soul to Lucifer. Like we know this by now. And the historians refer to Rodrigo Borgia and his children as the Black Legend. Because again, it's not just about one member of the Borgia family, it's about all the members of them all meshed together that makes the story so salacious. Now, in Italy in the 15th century, like we talked about last week, it wasn't a political entity. So just to recap a little bit, it wasn't just one country. We had the Kingdom of Naples, Milan, Florence, Venice. We had all these principalities and these duchies that had their own rulers. And then in the middle of all of this is the Vatican. The Vatican is technically located in the Kingdom of Naples, which is how the Borgias end up in Italy, because the Borgias are actually a Spanish family. They're from the Kingdom of Aragon, which I sent you a picture of Spain back in this time. Spain was not Spain as we know it today either, just like Italy isn't Italy today. So, so we had Castile and we had Aragon. And so in Granada, you had Navarre up top, which is the French area, and then of course Portugal. So these are all in Spain, what we call Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. We have all these little duchies and principalities and kingdoms. So the Borgia family is from Aragon. Now, in the history books, it will tell you the real patriarch, the one we got to talk about, is Alfonso Borgia, who was Rodrigo's uncle. He's the one that started it all. Now, they were considered to be a middle-class family, the Borgias, before they came to Italy. I don't know, though, because there's other resources that say that the Borgias actually do come from the same royal family, that like Ferdinand and Isabel, we're going to talk about them, that the kings of Aragon, that they actually come from that same family. So I don't know which one it is. Were they a middle-class family who rose to power, or were they actually a part of this royal bloodline? Probably they were a part of this royal bloodline, but it is what it is. So we got to start with Alfonso Borgia. So he was born in Valencia. I've been to Valencia in the Kingdom of Aragon. There's a really potent drink in Spain called Agua de Valencia. If you want to have a good time in Spain, get you some Agua de Valencia. You might not remember most of your night, but it's very fun. So he's from Valencia, and Alfonso de Borgia, so he was a 14th century guy. He was born in 1378. He was highly intelligent and found his way to school to study law. Because at this time, civil law and canon law were one and the same, right? The church and the state are not separate. So if you go to study law, you're going to be studying canon law as well. So he ended up became a lawyer and ended up becoming a cardinal for the Catholic Church. Now, because of his deep knowledge of politics, he was appointed secretary to King Alfonso V of Aragon. Now, King Alfonso V of Aragon was grandfather to Ferdinand II, who would eventually go on to send Christopher, as we're told in the official narrative, who knows if it's true or not, but as we're told, he was the one, Ferdinand II, that would go on to fund Christopher Columbus to go and discover America in 1492, the same year that Rodrigo Borgia became Pope. This is going to come into play later on. So we have Alfonso. He was secretary to King So Alfonso Borgia is secretary to King Alfonso. I love in the history, like everyone's got the same name. Like, were they not creative enough to come up with different names? So anyway, at this point, if you guys remember from last week, we talked about the Kingdom of Naples. At this point, Naples, remember last week when we talked about that nasty museum with all those dead people that were stuffed? That was the Spanish family that is governing Naples, where the papacy is. So because of Alfonso Borgia's relationship with King Alfonso V of Spain, he is sent to Naples to help govern this Kingdom of Naples. In the meantime, in 1444, Alfonso Borgia is appointed bippity boppity boo. He's appointed a cardinal. So now, not only is he in high favor with the Spanish royal family, one of the Spanish royal families of Aragon, but he is now high up in the Vatican, which again, church and state are not separate. So this is a really powerful dude, really powerful across the board. At this point, Borgia is spelled Borja, but Alfonso was smart because he knew the political climate was so crazy. He changed the spelling of his name to Borgia to make it Italian, just to help neutralize himself for his own advantageous reaching within the power grab. Now, I don't know if Alfonso Borgia himself ever had children. None of his children have come up in any, he could have had children, but they just never come up. He did, however, have a sister named Isabel. Isabel had 2 children. One was a boy named Pedro Luis, and the youngest is a boy named Rodrigo. So as soon as Alfonso Borgia becomes a cardinal, he's already doing favors, which we'll get to, for his family over in Spain, but now he summons his 2 nephews to Rome. At this point, now, you might have heard me right, his sister is the one that has Rodrigo. So his sister's maiden name is Borgia, not their birth name by their father. So what's the first thing Rodrigo and Pedro Luis do when they get to Italy? They change their last names to their mother's maiden name. So I think that's interesting. It's not there, in this time in our history, as we do today, we take our father's names, we become a part of our father's family. But Rodrigo is going to rely on the power of his mother's family to get what he wants. All right, so Alfonso is in Italy. He's got his nephews there. And then something really, really, really life-changing happens for the Borgia family. And we're going to get into more details about Rodrigo, but I want to talk about Alfonso first. On April 8th of 1455, Alfonso, drumroll please, becomes Pope Calixtus III. So now, your uncle's the damn Pope. So, we've got Rodrigo and Pedro Luis running around Rome. They've been giving all these jobs. Rodrigo himself at this point is building a reputation as a young boy of being very smart, very cunning, and very debaucherous. And in all fairness, as historians will say, Uncle Pope Calixtus, who was Alfonso, actually there's not a whole lot of scandal associated with him. And all we can really say about him and what we know is that he kind of pushed the domino over and opened the door for Rodrigo, his nephew, to come in when all the debauchery really starts. Okay, so we have to talk about, Alfonso ends up dying in 1458. So he was only Pope for like 3 years. But nonetheless, the dominoes have been pushed over. And now the Borgias are a prominent family in the Vatican. So let's go back and talk about Rodrigo. So that's how they ended up in Italy from Spain. Now, Rodrigo Borgia was born on January 1 of 1431 in Valencia, where his family is from. Again, he adopted his mother's family name when his uncle gained power in Italy. Because of his uncle's standing with the King of Aragon and now in the Vatican, at 14 years old in 1445, Rodrigo was working for the Cathedral of Valencia. Kind of like we talked about with Pope Innocent VIII last week. So at 14 years old, Rodrigo is telling people what to do with their effing lives. What 14-year-old has the wherewithal to have this much power? But because Uncle is pulling strings, at this point, Uncle's just a cardinal, but he's able to pull strings to get his nephews these powerful jobs. And they're starting to make a lot of money. I mean, Rodrigo Borgia, by the time he dies, he's one of the wealthiest men in all of Europe. So, 1448, he moves to Rome. This is when Rodrigo moves to Rome with Uncle, to live with his uncle. The uncle, however, secured Rodrigo with an annual income from the Cathedral of Valencia even though he's not in Valencia doing work. So at a very young age, Rodrigo is basically given an annual income to party, to spend money. I mean, he's given the nicest of apartments at the Vatican with his uncle. Like, it's mind blowing. Like, talk about, like, I hate the word privileged kids, but this is like the epitome of like a privileged kid who is learning no lessons about how to be a decent human being, you know? So he started studying law in Valencia just like his uncle. And then he continues when he gets to the Vatican, he continues to study law with better tutors. Now, Rodrigo, I say this all the time, Rodrigo Borgia might be many things, but he certainly is not stupid. Rodrigo is probably one of the smartest popes, cardinals, historical people that have ever walked across our history, pages of history. He's just smart. You cannot take that away from him. And I said on my show, you know, my mother used to tell us all the time that she would rather us have street smarts than book smarts, because you could get further with street smarts than you can book smarts. But Rodrigo had both. Rodrigo was one of these people who was able to understand law, thoroughly understand law, to the point where he was able to manipulate that law. He was also smart enough and cunning enough to be able to use that to his advantage even at a very young age. So it's hard when you've got somebody that's this devious who is also really smart. That's a tough opponent to have in the world, right? So you know, it's not shocking to me that Rodrigo gets where he gets. He's smart enough. He's cunning enough to know how to do this. You know, again, he was known to visit, and I'm sure I couldn't find any pictures or paintings of him when he was a younger lad. All we really have of him is when he was older and he was a pope and he was kind of chunky and had a big nose. But I'm sure when he was younger, he was probably quite debonair. You know, he apparently loved the ladies. He was definitely a womanizer, as we'll see with his children. His sons definitely get the same reputation, more so than his brother. Pedro Luis, like, bless his heart, he just kind of got lost in history, his brother, because his other brother was such a freaking douchebag that Pedro Luis just kind of like slipped away because he couldn't compete with Rodrigo, right? And Rodrigo's debaucherous ways. So now, again, we get the whole, so nepotism comes from this Napoleonic kingdom. Nepotism, we know, means giving your children or your family jobs, right? Giving them favors. That's nepotism. Yeah. Well, this word comes about, nepotism, because of the Borgias, because of all the stuff that the Borgias do for each other to get themselves in places of power. It's coming from the Napoleon, which is the kingdom of Naples, which is what they're associated with. I thought that was interesting. That's where this word comes from, is this Borgia family. All right. And
Wow.
so, and at this point too, when Borgia, Rodrigo was running around as a very young lad, and his uncle is just a cardinal now. He hasn't even become the Pope. The Borgias, because of Rodrigo's cunning ways, the Borgias at this point are starting to get a reputation. Now, again, I want to reiterate this because we know historically the Borgias weren't doing anything else that anybody else wasn't doing. They were all living off of bribes and hits and all, but the Borgias took it to an extreme. The Borgias went above and beyond what other people were doing. And so people started to fear Rodrigo. They started to fear, and it does seem like Rodrigo was more of the intellect, with Pedro Luis was more of like the militant, like he was more of the athlete. And so they would get nervous about Rodrigo being out in the streets. They would kind of, you'll see this with his son Cesare later on, because Cesare kind of becomes an assassin for his father. So we know, it's my speculation, that Rodrigo, even though we don't have a lot of information on Alfonso, Uncle Pope, and people say it seems like he was just a pretty normal, average guy, maybe perhaps Rodrigo was pulling hits for his uncle. I don't know, or other people for favors and for jobs. Who knows? You know, so at this point, because people feared the Borgias so much, we started to first hear rumors. This is before his children are even born. This is like when it's just Rodrigo and Uncle Pope and his brother, that they were not actually European, they were actually Jewish, or they were actually Moors because they were olive skin. I mean, people were starting to create rumors about these guys because people started to disappear, kind of like the Clintons. The Clintons have had a lot of people around them disappear. Same thing was happening with the Borgias even before the children are born. People just disappear around the Borgias. Again, this is the inspiration for the Godfather. So people are very nervous of this family that's gaining power. So after Uncle Pope becomes Pope in 1455, and we're just going to go through a brief timeline. And then again, when we get to the individual children, we'll re-merge some of this stuff with some of the scandals that were happening. So in 1457, Uncle Pope appointed the very young Cardinal Borgia to the position of Vice Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church. Now, Rodrigo had become a cardinal, was given that power of cardinal when he was like 25. And even back then, that was really young for a cardinal. Even back then, people were like, does he have enough life experience to do this job? But it didn't matter. He got the job as cardinal. So then he's given the role of Vice Chancellor of the Holy Roman Empire. This gave Rodrigo, as well as the Borgia dynasty, more and more political power and more money. Now, spoiler alert, Rodrigo would hold this position for 35 years until he himself became the Pope. So just remember that. 1458, Uncle Pope dies. And Rodrigo supports the papacy of Pope Pius VII. If he agreed, so he told Pope Pius, the guy who was Pope Pius II, I will support you becoming the Pope if you agree to allow me to keep my position as the Vice Chancellor. And Pope Pius II said, sure, cool. So that's how it's bribery. It's all based on bribery. That's all it's bakshish. It's all just bribery and extortion and exploitation. That's all the Vatican is. That's all it is. It's just a political entity. There's no talk of God. I mean, if you watch the Borgia series on Showtime, do they ever mention God? No. You know, it's a political entity. 1464, we have now a new pope. This is Pope Paul II, and Pope Paul II and Borgia were already besties. They were already besties. So no problems there with this guy becoming the pope, because obviously you're going to take care of your bestie. 1471, Sixtus IV is now the pope. He promotes Borgia to the role of cardinal bishop, which I'm not really sure what. I'm not a Catholic. I guess cardinal bishop is even a higher position in the cardinal grouping of men. So it gives him even more power. Now, you guys, get this. So in 1472, Pope Sixtus IV, who's on the papacy throne, who's given Borgia even more power, sends Borgia on a very important errand for him. So we have all these marriages within the monarchy, right? And they have to be approved. This is before the Protestant Reformation. This is part of the reason why there was a Protestant Reformation, LOL, was all this debauchery. But any marriage within the monarchy has to be approved by the papacy. So if you're a king and you want to marry a princess of another country, the Pope has to bless it. It's part of the reason why King Henry VIII separated from the Vatican, because they wouldn't give him an annulment to Catherine of Aragon, which we're going to get to. So Rodrigo Borgia, Cardinal Borgia, is sent back to Aragon for Pope Sixtus IV to give dispensation. Get this, you guys. I cannot believe people don't talk about this with Rodrigo Borgia. To Queen Isabella II of Castile, for our Queen Isabella, our princess at this time, she's just Princess Isabella of Castile, to Ferdinand II of Aragon. Y'all, if you are European or of European descent, or if you live anywhere in the American continent, this decision affected your life. Who are these two people? Who are these two clowns? This Ferdinand II and this Isabella. This is the famous Ferdinand and Isabel. These were the two marriages that created Spain as a country. Remember that story? These are the people who funded Christopher Columbus to go to America. These are the people who had Catherine of Aragon, who was Henry VIII's first wife, whom I just referenced, whom he wanted to divorce to marry Anne Boleyn. If Rodrigo Borgia had not given dispensation to these two people, if he had said, no, I don't think this is a good idea for you two to get married, I might not be here today. Anybody who's living in America or any part of the American continent, South America, Latin America, we might not be here today because history would have played out differently. So the fact that people, when we talk about Rodrigo Borgia, all we talk about is the orgies in the Vatican, and we don't mention these things, is like, it blows my mind. It blows my mind. Because he's the one that was like, bippity boppity boo, it's cool if you guys get married. So as much of a horrific human being as he was, the fact that he gave dispensation for this marriage is the reason why I'm sitting here right now, sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, talking to you guys.
Right.
So I gotta give Rodrigo a high five for that. So it's not all dark.
Indeed. That's very interesting, Brice. That's actually super interesting. Yeah.
And it just shows you how big those parties were for people not to even talk about that, instead focus on
too many other interesting things.
I know, people are like, shut up about the history. Let's look at the party again.
Yeah.
This is before he's even Pope. Well, the fact that Pope Sixtus IV gave him the power to make that decision. So Pope Sixtus was like, Rodrigo, I don't know, dude. You decide. You go to Aragon. You're from Aragon. That's where your family's from. You go there and decide if you think these two should be married. So, like, I guess thank you, Rodrigo, for that at least. Now, when he becomes Pope, there's another really big thing he did. Do we have anybody in the audience who is from South America, who's from Brazil or Argentina or any of the countries in South America, Peru? There's a very famous story. Now, if you're familiar with South America, Brazil, they speak Portuguese, and the rest of South America, they speak Spanish. Why is this? Now, there's a very famous story. We hear it as American kids growing up, and we learn about this continent being settled, of a pope who drew a line in South America and said, this side belongs to the Portuguese, and this side belongs to the Spanish. And that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese, and the rest of South America speaks Spanish. The pope who drew that line, Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. So if you are from Brazil, the reason why you speak Portuguese is because of Rodrigo Borgia. If you are from any other of the countries in South America, Argentina, Peru, whatever, the reason you speak Spanish and not Portuguese is because of Rodrigo Borgia. I speak English in America because there were wars fought between France and England, and if England hadn't have won, I'd be speaking French right now. But Rodrigo Borgia just famously drew a line, and that was that. So there are some things, big things, as I was saying, historically that he did that don't even get talked about because his debauchery in his private life is way more fascinating for people to talk about than this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. Now, the Borgia became so close to Ferdinand and Isabel by giving them dispensation that he literally becomes their first son's godfather. Which I think is funny because the Godfather is inspired by the Borgias. So he was literally the future king of Spain's godfather. I mean, that's power. Because Spain at this point was one of the biggest empires in Europe. You know, Spain was a huge empire in Europe at this point, very powerful. That was the alliance that Henry VII of the Tudor line made with Ferdinand and Isabel, because having his son marry their daughter, Spain was so big, was such a huge empire to have that alliance with. So this is huge. This is huge. So then he comes back from that errand for Sixtus. That basically is the reason why I'm sitting here right now. And he meets Bonazza de Caterine. I hope I'm saying that right. So this is an Italian woman who became Cardinal, at this point, just Cardinal Borgia's chief mistress. All right. Now, Bonazza is an interesting woman herself. She was married 3 times, but was very known that her loyalty was to Borgia. That was her main husband, basically, even though they weren't married. And she herself was an Italian woman. Now, there's rumors and speculations about her. Some people say she owned like inns, but people think that might be a cover for the fact that she was a courtesan, which is a sex worker. In the Showtime series, they do play with that she was actually a sex worker, a courtesan. But nonetheless, she becomes Borgia's main chief mistress. And so this is where we see the kids being born. So Cesare was born in 1475. Giovanni, who would become known as Juan, that would be his nickname, was born in 1476. Lucrezia, the first of the kids that we're going to talk about next week, was born in 1480. And Joffrey was born in 1481. Now, what I want to talk about too with these children being born, so they're born before their father is even Pope. He's just a cardinal at this time. Rodrigo Borgia had about 10 or 11 illegitimate children. So these are just 4 of his children. And a lot of people are like, why? I'm like, why were these kids the ones that were used by him and favored by him? And I wondered that too. Like, why were these kids? We don't see much about his other kids. So I went and I found the names of his other kids because they are listed. He acknowledged all of them as his children. And it's very simple. The reason why these 4 are the ones that were used and abused by him. They're the only ones that lived to adolescent and adulthood. The other 6 to 7 kids all died before they were like 5 years old. So my thinking, that's just what happened back then. Kids just sickness, people, they got sick, they got whatever. A lot of kids just didn't survive that long back then. There was one period of time where people didn't even name their children until they were like 5 because they didn't know if they were going to live. So I fully believe, and I really don't think these kids were used like in any ritualistic way because they were given his last name. They were honored, they were acknowledged by him. So they were hierarchy kids. I just don't think they just babies just died back then. Things just happened. Malaria. This is Italy. This is how there's malaria. There's diseases everywhere. It just happens sometimes. So I do believe that if his other children by other mistresses had lived, there were a few children with Venosa that died before reaching adolescence. So I think if the other kids had lived, they would be basically the same situation. They'd be used by him as well. I don't think there's any specific reason. The only reason why these 4 children are the ones that are in the history books is simply because they lived long enough to be in the history books, to be able to make debaucherous decisions on their own. So now, because of Voneza's interesting past, we'll say history, Rodrigo takes, and it's fascinating, and this is something I debate because the interest that there are situations where Rodrigo, you look at him and he does seem like a very involved and caring father. Like we'll talk about when Juan ends up dead, his son Juan. He ends literally up. He literally ends up swimming with the fishes, as they say in the mafia. They find him in a river, and we'll get to that with Juan's passing when he was young, when he was like a young man. But when Juan died, Rodrigo went into mourning for his son. So it's interesting, the complexities of the. I think that's why the Borgias are so fascinating to us, even to this day. There's a complexity here with the relationship with Rodrigo with his children, and I look at you look at the relationship, the closeness, the fondness. Rodrigo was very fond of his children. He loved he idolized his children. He used them as pawns, but he was also very protective of them as well. And you see that in the Showtime series. They play that very, very well in the Showtime series. And I keep thinking, if we took Rodrigo, Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffrey, if we pulled them from 500 years ago and we placed them in our society today, I don't think that we would see his relationship with his children as any different from any other fathers, besides the whole using them as pawns for political games. If we just looked at his closeness with his kids and what he really knew his kids, like he knew his kids. which back in those days with nobility, and I have some ideas around that, why that happened with their particular relationship. Back in these days with nobility, especially with like monarchy, the kids really did not have, it was important to have children, to have a bloodline, but the kids were not raised by their parents. There was not an invested relationship with these prince and princesses with their parents. Not like we see with Rodrigo and his children, right? There's an investment. You know, I would guess to say that most kings and queens didn't even know what their kid's favorite color was. But Rodrigo would know what his kid's favorite color was. So there's definitely a very, even though I think he was very narcissistic and psychotic in a lot of ways, we also see this like split personality almost, where there's also a very paternal love for his children. Now, again, maybe that's part of his own disassociation. Maybe we're looking at the results of a man who possibly was abused as a child, and that split disassociation of loving your children, but also using your children and doing inappropriate things with your children. You know, it's sometimes it's very complex, and it's that humanity in us. But nonetheless, Vonesa, his chief mistress, everybody knew who she was. She was his chief mistress. Everybody knew she was the mother of his children. These were 4 full-blooded siblings. So same mother, same father, full-blooded siblings. Because of her sketchy path, it was advantageous for Rodrigo to remove the children. So they lived in the suburbs, in a little area outside of the Vatican, what we would call the suburbs, in a very nice area. He moved the children from the suburbs into the Vatican, into his apartments, in order to give them a better, what's perceived to be a better education and a better life. Mainly, again, for him, is it value for the kids, or is it more value for Rodrigo or the House of Borgia? I don't know. But to get them away from the mother, being under the mother's roof, where she has this sketchy reputation, and be with him, the cardinal, as the cardinal's, where he becomes the primary parent, the primary caregiver. Does that make sense? Like the mom's not Vonesa is not the primary caregiver in this situation. Rodrigo is. He's playing the primary parent with his kids. Okay. Right. So even though they have a close relationship with their mom, and they see their mom, and their mom comes to, Rodrigo is the primary parent now. And we're going to talk more about what that means for the kids next week when we get to Lucrezia, because this is very important to remember. So, all right. So in 1480, so this is before Borgia is the Pope. Pope Sixtus IV legitimizes Cesare as a favor to Borgia. By 7, Cesare was serving in church positions. So Cesare, and there's a big debate amongst historians whether Cesare was the oldest son or Juan was the oldest son. 100%, in my opinion, Cesare was the oldest son. Like, we just see oldest sibling, you know, Cesare definitely takes the role of the oldest sibling, even though they were all very close in age in this family. And the fact that as a favor to Borgia, to Rodrigo, Cesare is actually legitimized. So that's right, giving Borgia even more power, because his oldest son has now been legitimized. He's already powerful. Cesare Borgia is already powerful as an illegitimate son of a cardinal. Cesare Borgia's life as an illegitimate son of a cardinal is way more valuable than most prince and princesses. But now that he's legitimized, this might be why he's the Jesus painting. I don't know. We'll talk about that when we get to Cesare Borgia. So Borgia, by 1483, Borgia is the wealthiest cardinal and the most powerful cardinal in all of the world. Is getting serious. So even when his kids are like little, he's already using them, right? So the Papal Conclave of 1492, no God, only business, because Borgia's wealth, power, and the ability to scare people. Never forget that ability to scare people. That's real important. He became the Pope on the 11th of August, 1492. So in 1492, while Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, discovering America, he is now Pope Alexander VI.
Wow.
And Cesare becomes the Archbishop of Valencia. So Cesare is he's a big one. He's a big one. Cesare, he's a big child. He He's the etherical bad boy of the. And I sent you a picture from the Showtime show, Shanti, of the whole family. It's a beautiful picture with it's the actors. It's not the real people, obviously, but I can kind of show you. So this is from the Showtime series. So obviously we have Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia. He's the dude in the middle with the white on. The young girl, the blonde girl, that's Lucrezia. The man with the all black outfit on, that's Cesare Borgia. And then Juan is the other younger gentleman over to the left of Cesare. The little boy behind Juan is Joffrey, the youngest brother. Now, the two women behind him are his two main mistresses. So, and the woman on the left is the actress who plays Vonaza. She is the mother of these four children. So again, I want to reiterate, these four children were all full-blooded siblings. And this is going to make a difference when we really get into their stories. The reason why I'm reiterating that, they're full-blooded siblings, meaning they have the same mother and they have the same father. That's going to be very important when we look at the psychology behind the children and their part they play in this debauchery of the tale of the Borgia family. Now, all children, as in 1492, when he becomes Pope Alexander VI, through hell or high water, bribery, all that kind of stuff, he finally becomes the most kingiest of kings, the most powerful ruler in the land in 1492. At that time, all of his children are given titles and given land. So Lucrezia herself was only 12 years old when her father became Pope. Joffrey, the youngest, he was 11 years old. These were very young people, very young children, and they're given titles and land. In 1492, Juan himself is made a cardinal. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia's 12-year-old daughter, Lucrezia, is married off. We'll talk about that next week because there's a lot about that we're going to get into with Lucrezia herself. Now, Borgia starts to cut deals with different principalities. So he cuts a deal with France and he allows the French armies to take control of part of Italy. So that's how he gets control as the Pope, by making these deals with all these different countries over power grabs for the very luscious land of Italy, the agriculture of Italy. He now, at this point, decides to appoint 12 more cardinals to back him. So his Uncle Pope only needed 2 cardinals, but Rodrigo has made such an enemy of himself that he's got to have 12 cardinals appointed into the cardinaldom, whatever that's called, to back him, to protect him, because he's hated by so many people. Now, he eventually breaks his alliance with France to create more alliance with German principalities and with Spain. So in 1494, France comes back to sack Florence and then goes to Rome. Rome is now under siege. In 1495, an agreement is made between the Pope and the King of France to stop the siege of Rome. And I say this just briefly now, guys, because this is going to come hugely into Lucrezia's story next week, right? We could literally do a 5-hour show and just talk about all of them at once, but I think that's kind of culty to be on a show for 5 hours. So I feel like we need to look at them individually and then intermarry them. So we're going to kind of go back and forth with what was happening with the political fuckery, we'll say, that Pope Alexander VI finds himself in, and how he gets himself out of these has to do with his daughter Lucrezia. All right. So, so Joanne, you said horrific for her. Yes, I actually I got emotional this morning thinking about Lucrezia Borgia. Now, unfortunately, Lucrezia, out of all of her family members, there have been operas written about Lucrezia. There have been books written about Lucrezia. She is known as the femme fatale of the Vatican. There have been just stories and movies just made just on Lucrezia. And I think that out of all of the Borgias, she is the one that is probably the most innocent in this. And one of the historians said that Lucrezia carries the scarlet letter of her Borgia family because she's a woman. And it's because she was the only daughter of Pope Alexander VI. And we have to remember that when you're that powerful, you have to see your children not as children, but as investments, as stock. The daughter stock is always going to be higher than the man stock, the son stock. Why? Because a daughter is not a female throughout all the lands with every level of poverty to riches. Women at this point are not autonomous people. They are not their own person. They are owned by either their father or their husband. So with that being said, when you are the Pope and you marry your child to another kingdom, you have handcuffed your family to that kingdom. Now for the boys, for his sons, they're the top, right? They're the men. So women that marry, princesses that marry the sons, they're moving up in ranking to the man's family. But women, if a woman marries below her ranking, she's pulling her family down in value. If a woman marries up in ranking, she's pulling her family up. So Lucrezia, the whole weight of the Borgia dynasty is on the shoulders of a 12-year-old little girl who is still playing with dolls. And so her father is going to maneuver her. Literally, he's literally going to whore her out, sorry for saying it that way, to all of these powerful families in order to get what he wants. And Lucrezia, I mean, we'll talk about her next week. My heart breaks for her. And I decided with Lucrezia, we'll talk about some of the scandals that are related to Lucrezia, but most of the big salacious stuff I'm going to save for Cesare, because Cesare was literally the bad boy. And so my heart just go.
Excuse me, bless me, gosh.
Bless you. I think a lot of women, I think another reason why Lucrezia has maintained one of the most famous Borgias, I think women throughout history since Lucrezia lived 500 years, I think every woman watching right now, I think we all have a little bit of Lucrezia Borgia in us. I think we've all had moments where we've felt used and abused by a man, or we felt like we didn't have a voice. And even though we live 500 years separated from her life, I think there's so much relatability to Lucrezia from all of us. And yeah, we're going to talk about, and the thing about Cesare, her brother, like I do think her brother Cesare, there were rumors and speculation that they were having an incestuous relationship. I don't know if we'll talk about where those rumors came from, but I do think regardless of that or not, whether that's true or not, we do see Cesare was very protective of Lucrezia, but he also used her too. And that's what's so fascinating about this family, you guys. It goes back to that complexity. It's like in the same action, you see them loving each other, but also using each other at the same time. It's wild. It's just, I would love for a forensic psychologist to study this family and tell us what the hell is going on with this family. I mean, granted, they lived 500 years ago, so obviously culture and society are very different than where we live now. But it's as Mark Twain said, the truth is often stranger than fiction. And this family, their truth is definitely stranger than fiction. And just again, the enmeshment, it's wild. So anyway, Juan shows up dead in the Tiger River. That murder is still unsolved. Although we'll talk about people actually think Cesare killed him. That's like the most that's the biggest suspect. But most historians are like, listen, everyone hated the Borgias. All of Rome could be anyone. It could be anyone. So it's still an unsolved mystery. But we'll talk about Juan and Cesare's relationship and his relationship with his siblings and his father. But the year 501, there was a very famous party called the Chestnut Banquets, where apparently there was a huge orgy that involved Rodrigo and his children and some nuns. We'll talk about that with Cesare, though.
Some nuns too.
Some nuns were getting naughty. I know that's people's fetishes, but literally there's some.
We'll have none of that.
None. I mean, nuns aren't really that attractive. I mean, I think they were. I mean, obviously there were sex workers that were hired as well, but yeah. I mean, nuns got to have fun too, right? They're still human beings as well. Now the interesting. Now, Rodrigo Borgia died on the 18th of August, 1503, at 72 years old, and y'all, they still don't know how he died. He either got malaria or was poisoned.
We'll just go with malaria. It's fine. It's easier.
It's malaria. I'm like, that motherfucker was poisoned. Let's just call a spade. Exactly. Let's call a spade a spade. You mean to tell me you're debating over whether it was malaria or poisoning after all the shit they did in Rome? Like, that motherfucker was poisoned.
Yeah, like, no, he got malaria from a stray mosquito that got caught in the wind from Africa.
He was the innocent pope. He was a God-fearing man. Who would want to poison him? Who would want to poison him? I will say all of his children. So Cesare, I cannot wait to talk about Cesare. Cesare was such a bad boy, and he was hot, you guys. And and he was so bad, but he was so hot. Like, that's my downfall. I've told you guys before. If you are a hot man, that's my weak point, because we talked about it with that dude in Russia. I'm like, the actor who played Cesare, that is a good-looking man. That is a very good-looking man who played. You want to pull up that family picture? I mean, I'll pull more pictures up when we talk about Cesare. But this guy, thank God these children got their mother's genes. I mean, the guy in the back there, he's obviously, these are actors. He's alive today. This guy is hot, and he plays Cesare Borgia, and they did perfect casting, because Cesare Borgia, even all the kids, like Lucrezia they were all known to be very good-looking kids, right? I think this is the last time the Cabal has actually been attractive. I think this was the last time, because Shanti and I were talking offline. They sure ain't attractive now. This is the last time they actually had some good genes to make them look pretty. But all the kids, all the Borgia kids, all 4 of them were known to be very good looking, to be very sexy. And that was that, and so Cesare only lived to like 30 years old. Juan was killed early. Joffrey died young after. I mean, they all had kids. They all went on to have their own kids, but they were all killed by enemies, by like people who hated the Borgias. Lucrezia died at 39 years old in childbirth, which we'll talk about. She was the only one that kind of died with dignity, was Lucrezia. And we'll talk more about her next week. But yeah, I would totally suggest you guys. I know Joanne has watched the Showtime series. It's only 3 seasons, but it's just the Borgias. It's on Amazon Prime if you're here in the United States, wherever you guys live.
Is it on Netflix?
It might be, wherever you live in the world. No, different countries have different availability with Netflix. But if you just look up the Borgias with Jeremy Irons, which he's a big actor, they do a really good job following there are a few places where they do take artistic license, which we'll talk about that with Lucrezia. There's sometimes they take artistic license with her story, but I understand why they're doing that with her, because we'll get into it next week. But it pretty much follows the actual story of the Borgia family. Right. So, yeah, and that could be, I mean, listen, if those are the Pope today's ancestors, LOL, like, that's embarrassing. I'm sorry, like,
right, exactly.
That's mortifying that your ancestor, like, I know I'm a direct descendant of King James, of the King James Bible, and I'm embarrassed by that. Like, that is embarrassing. Dude was a freaking awful man. That to know that your ancestors were so scandalous that they created a freaking Showtime series.
Just especially for them. Yeah.
They didn't have to make it. Wrote itself. The script wrote itself. Like, they didn't even have to. Exactly. So it's that's super embarrassing. But apparently there are a lot of, and I was looking on Reddit when I was researching. There are a lot of Borgia descendants in the world today, obviously, because the kids had kids, the kids had kids, and some people didn't even know they were Borgia descendants until they did their DNA testing. So a lot of them are in South America. Today,
right.
Obviously in Italy, how wild is that to find out that your 16th great grandfather was a pope?
Right.
Like, I just,
wow.
So, oh, thank you.
Wow.
Yeah. So as I said on my channel, we're gonna do ladies first. We're gonna do Lucrezia next week. Again, I have a
Right.
lot of empathy for this girl. I probably will get emotional talking about her story because it's just a very sad story of her life and what she was forced to do, and she had no power. And we'll talk about, of course, the whispers of her poisoning people. Part of me, can I just say, this might make me sound like a terrible person, but when you hear the story of Lucrezia Borgia and what she had to deal with in her life, if she was poisoning people, I don't really blame her. Like, I'm just like,
Yeah, exactly. It's
go
like
girl,
enough already.
get it,
Yeah,
girl. Like,
enough.
if you got to drop some poison into people's drinks because you're being violated against your will, then I have no problem with it. So, yeah,
Exactly.
Charmaine, she was married at 12. We'll talk about that next week. It's very sad,
Yeah.
very sad. She was a little girl. Yeah.
Anyway, let's hope we're doing our bit to change all of that.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you with Brice again on Wednesday, where we're going to be talking about more scandalous stuff, no doubt. So stay tuned on Solutions with Shanti on Wednesday. Okay, everybody, God bless. Yo, oh, thank you so much for joining Brice and myself. And Brice, thank you for bringing us your expertise and your knowledge, our favorite professor. Yeah. Cheers, guys. Thank you.